So we'll get started a couple minutes early here just to get the general introductions out of the way. My name is Heather Gonzago. I'm here with my colleague Kelly Hutchins. We both work on the JavaScript API team. Been with the company for a really long time. So if you've seen our names around, it may not necessarily be for JavaScript stuff either. A little bit of background, I worked on the Flex API when we had the Flex API and transitioned over into JavaScript. So I don't know about any of you guys. We like to do a little bit of around, raise hands and so forth to get an idea of where your background is from. But at one point in time, I was in your shoes, basically trying to learn. I knew the underlying concepts of a lot of this stuff, but the JavaScript API I was completely new on. So I can kind of get an understanding of where some of you what you may be feeling. Do you want to say anything?
No, I think you got it.
You got it? Yeah? Okay. Who here are developers by trade? Just JavaScript developer? You've done JavaScript programming? Yeah? All right. Who here had a job that your manager's like, all right, we've seen this really cool stuff with creating web applications. We want you to go in and do it. You may or may not have messed with it before, but now you're kind of thrown into it and you're sink or swim, you're going to learn. Anybody? Yeah, okay. I get it. That's kind of where my background is. I was a geography background way back in the day. So is Kelly. And we just, as you know, tools of the trade, you just learn as you go along. So trying to get an idea here of tailoring to our audience. So this is an introduction. We are going to give you kind of a very high-level approach to what you guys should expect when working with the JavaScript API. We started doing, this session's been around, these intro sessions have been around for a long time, but what we thought would be kind of cool a few years ago when we first started it was, instead of just kind of giving you guys a bunch of theoretical, this is what a layer is, this is what maps are, this is how to work in a web application, trying to actually show you something as a new user coming in, creating your application from scratch. So, some of the steps that you're going to need to do, setting up your development environment, bringing your maps in, adding layers, rendering your layers, making your layers interactive, so maybe adding some pop-ups, some queries, and then lastly, working with widgets. So like you want some search functionality, legends, all different types of widgets that we have. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to start from scratch, and then we're going to build up on that. This particular demo, as pretty much all of our demos are now during these conferences, we focus on 4x. We still have 3x. So the concepts that we're giving to you guys today, it's still going to be the same, regardless of whether or not you're working in 3x or in 4x. We have all of the demos, all of the stuff that we're going to be showing you is going to be accessible on Kelly's. Why didn't you guys tell me? How long was it going to take? I had it turned off for the beginning while I was opening up a couple things. You didn't miss much. I'm sorry. So here we just have the agenda and then our presentations. So all of the presentations are accessible on just github.com, Kelly Hutchins. I'll give you guys a sec here if you want to take a picture. And what you'll notice is, there you go. I'm going to actually open up the page too, so if you guys want to see in here, it says Getting Started. That was the original name. They changed it to Introduction, so it'll be the Getting Started Web Dev. And then under the Demos folder, and we're going to go through each of these demos. We also have the demos, so these are all JavaScript written, but we also have the equivalent of the same exact demo written in TypeScript. I didn't ask that question. Is there anybody here who has done some TypeScript development? Anybody? Okay, a couple in the back. So for those of you who have, or those of you who haven't, if you're inclined or interested, you can take a look at those demos as well and basically see how you would go ahead and write the equivalent of that within TypeScript. So let's go back in. All right, so first and foremost, where do you begin? You're going to want to make sure that you know this URL and you get very familiarized with it. Basically, the developers.arcgis.com, it's JavaScript. We have, this is the main landing page. It's going to be for the latest, so it's going to be for the 4X version, but you can get to the 3X version from this as well. So if you just click on the go to 3.325, which is our latest, it's basically going to give you similar to what you saw within the 4X version. Let's go back here. All right. We have it broken down based upon whether you want to work with specific guide topics, your API reference, or working with sample snippets. If we start first within the guide topic, you're going to see here on each individual release, we're going to tell you all of the new cool things that came out, any breaking changes that we may have had to update or break between versions. So we always have that stuff listed in here. Any new classes, any bug fixes. So those of you who may go in to call support up and log particular bugs, all of those things will be listed here as well if I can type. Yeah. We have our system requirements, just a bunch of different information. I did mention a little bit about working with 3 or 4. The concepts of what we're going to be talking about today are very, very similar. If you're coming in brand new and you're not quite certain exactly what you should be working with, this is a good place to start. Choosing a version will give you the capabilities, the main capabilities of what we have and what we do not have yet, like in 3 or within 4. So y'all may or may not know, but in 3X you cannot work with, there's no 3D functionality, all right? That is specifically with 4. So if you have an application that your boss is saying you need to go in and you need to create, and there is a general requirement that you may be having to work with some 3D data, you're probably going to want to focus specifically on 4. But this is basically where you're going to want to go in and just double check and make sure. If you are, maybe let's say you are converting your applications over from 3 to 4 and you're not quite sure exactly what a specific layer or a method is called. Some of them are called the same exact thing, some of them aren't. One of my favorites from ArcGIS 3 was the ArcGIS Dynamic Map Service Layer. Mouthful. And I could never remember the whole thing all the time. I would always is it an ArcGIS Map Dynamic Service Layer? Whatever it may be. We got rid of that long name and now it's just called the Map Image Layer. So same functionality, same type of layer, it's just now called the Map Image Layer. All right. Working with the API, so this is going to give you some of the high-level topics and concepts. We've got a really good topic here about visualization, and just some of the odds and ends things. So, for those of you who might be working with secured services, you're working with proxy pages, you have some cores questions, things like that, all of that's going to be listed under here as well. The API reference is probably going to be between the API reference and the sample code. These are the 2 tabs you're probably going to be hitting the most. This is where you're going to want to go in here if you know, all right, I'm going to be working with the map image layer. All right, so I want to take a look here and see, I can type this in. This is a little bit different. So for those of you who worked with 3X, you may have remembered the pain that went into trying to find specific classes and methods and properties that you were looking for. You could search for it, but it wasn't quite this simple. Now we have this, it's a really easy search functionality. Basically just go in, start typing, and it's going to give you whatever it finds here. So the very top one we know is this map image layer class. I can click on this. It's going to go ahead and tell me the syntax for requiring it, which class, with the actual class name, inheritance, and a good description. So what we're also trying to do is give you a really good a bulk of information directly within the API reference itself. So not just relying upon guide topics and within sample code. You can actually open up the API reference, go to a class or method, and hopefully get enough information in there. Now, it's not going to be for everything, but you should get at least enough to get you started, get you underway, so you know where you need to head. Sample code, same exact thing. If I want to go in here and I say, all right, I want to work with some sort of search widget functionality. I could search for that. It's going to go ahead, give me, basically what we do in the samples, we've got tags on them, and it's going to search based on the tag that we have for those samples. And then lastly, we have our community tab, and this is super important. This is completely free. This is a place where you guys can go, ask for help from other people. Don't be shy, don't ever be embarrassed. I always say no question is ever a dumb question, because someone else, I'm sure, is thinking the same exact thing. And it's a great place to learn new stuff or show off things that maybe you've created. So definitely get familiarized with it if you aren't already. But yeah, so the SDK, developers.arcgis.com, JavaScript, that's going to be the main go-to that you should be using for all of the questions and things that you might have with getting started on this. All right, I talked a little bit about which of the version of the API is best. You can choose, there's a section there within the guide topics, and I'm going to have Kelly talk.
Thanks, Heather. So developer setup, it's a little different than maybe if you came from Flex or Silverlight, where Flex, you use Flex Build ArcGIS, and Silverlight had its, sort of integrated environment. With JavaScript, you have a ton of choices, and lots of people use different things. Even within Esri on the JavaScript API and ArcGIS Online teams, everybody uses something that makes the most sense for them. We're not all standardized on one particular setup. I have been tending to use Visual Studio Code probably for the last year or so, because I've been doing a lot of TypeScript, and it integrates really well, and it's also got a lot of really nice features like GitHub integration and sort of like intelligent. It learns about what's going on in your app, so if you start typing a variable, it knows you've already used it and lets you, get some sort of code assist. It's got lots of plugins available to make my life as a developer easier, so that works for me. But I've tried a bunch from Atom, Sublime, Brackets. We have people on the team who use WebStorm. So, I always say just go try a couple. There's lots of them that are free, and there's others that have free trials, so you can try it, see what works best for you. The slides are also available in that GitHub repository. So it has a link here to a particular web article that has, I guess they have like 41 different environments you can check out, and you can see, at a glance, the cost and the platform it works on, and, some basic reviews of it. So it's a nice way to get a quick look at the options available to you. I think, Heather, what are you using lately? Visual Studio?
Yeah, kind of just got easier.
And I use Visual Studio Code, not Visual Studio.
Visual Studio. Yeah. Visual Studio Code.
Yeah. Another place that you want to check out when you're getting started is this JSAPI Resources GitHub repository. Let's go there really quickly. We have it's under the Esri organization, so Esri JSAPI Resources. There is a 3x and a 4x folder. You can find things like this JS Hint file. So JS Hint is nice because it will help you. How many people are already using JS Hint? So if you're not, it's something you should look into. It'll find a lot of problems in your code. It can find some mistyped variables because it thinks it's like a unique variable. It can find trailing commas and missing semicolons. It can warn you about things like if your app is using double quotes in one place around a string and single quotes in other places. Some developers in their ecosystem care about that and others don't. So you can come here and get this JS Hint file. This is the JS Hint file the JS API team uses. If you click on it, it just has a bunch of options that you can say things that you want it to be strict about enforcing and other things that you might not care about it enforcing. Maybe you don't care if someone uses single quotes and somebody else uses double quotes, or you mix them in the same file. You can turn that option off here. You just place this file in your web server root directory, and the JS Hint plugin will sort of pick it up. Most development environments that I've worked on, Visual Studio Code, Sublime, Brackets, Atom, all have plugins available for JS Hint. So you would just get this file, install that plugin, and you'd be good to go. And it'll help find some problems in your code before you actually run it. So I highly recommend that. At the JS API Resources, you can also find the TypeScript definition file. I really like TypeScript. With TypeScript, you can get code complete, like full JS API, code assist. You can take advantage of ES6 capabilities now. There's a lot of really nice benefits to TypeScript, and if you're interested in that, you can find the definition file there. You can find build tools. So if you've heard of things like Bower and Webpack, if you want to make custom builds of the API, you can find information and demo samples about it there. We have a sample in the help that shows how to do OAuth. So that means prompting somebody for credentials when they're accessing secure resources. If you use the OAuth pop-up sample, it requires this callback page, and the callback page is available in the JS API Resources. So definitely check out that folder. Also SAS, if you're interested in working with SAS, you can find the SAS demos there as well. So the next thing we want to do is we're ready to actually start writing code. So the first thing we have to do is get the JavaScript API. The easiest way is to get it through the CDN, which is short for Content Delivery Network. This is the hosted version, so you can see the URLs there. The first link we have at the top is the link to the style sheet. So that's adding the CSS to your application. The link below it, the script tag, is pointing to the latest version of the JavaScript API. So you just include those in your HTML file, and you start writing code. You're up and running really fast. That's the easiest way. You can also look at a download version of the API and set it up and host it on your own web server and use it internally. Or you can do custom builds. And if you're interested in custom builds, that's using like the Web Optimizer or Webpack or Bower, and you want to check out the JS API Resources folder. We also have a help topic on that in the SDK. So there's a couple of different options for CSS. The first one is the simplest. It contains all the styles for the entire JavaScript API. You can find that in this main.css file. So that's the one you want to use if you're building an app that's got a lot of stuff going on, a lot of widgets. You don't want to worry about whether you have the CSS you need. Let's see if you're building just a simple app. It's maybe the map with the zoom in and zoom out, and you just want people to look quickly at your data. Well, if that's it, you can do view.css, and that's a smaller subset. It only includes a few of the styles, the map, widgets, and the map itself. We also have a few themes available that apply a color scheme to all of the widgets in the API. There's things like light and dark and purple and green and blue. You can use the themes, and they're under theme name /main CSS, and there is more information about the available themes in the SDK. And then finally, the last option, if you want the most control, that's using SAS. And if you're using SAS, there's a demo app in the JS API Resources directory that will help you get up and running if you're already familiar with using SAS. So the next thing you have to think of is we know how to get the API now, right? So we have to sort of answer this question about how will the app be written. Sometimes you'll see our sample apps in the API with all the code in one file. So you have an index.html file, and inside of it, it has the script tags with the JavaScript embedded inside. And that's fine if you're creating a simple app, maybe 20 lines of code or so. But once it starts getting to be a larger app, you want to have separate classes. You need to start breaking things out just for organization purposes. So in all the demo apps in this session, we have this structure that's listed here. So we have the demo folder. Underneath it, we have a CSS folder. Inside of that, we have our CSS files. We also have a JS folder, and inside that, we have all our JavaScript, and then we have the index.html that references those files. And let's see if you can kind of see, I think that the dark red on the black is probably a little hard to read, but underneath the link that links to the JS API's main.css file, you'll see a line. It's also a link, and it has an href of css/main.css. So that's saying go look in that CSS folder and get the main.css file. And you'll see the same thing with the JS. We're saying, hey, bring in this JavaScript file from this JS folder. So now let's look at this in action. And actually, I'm going to open it up in Visual Studio Code. Here's our end result app. Ignore the gigantic zoom in and zoom out. I had to make my resolution a little bigger. They don't look that giant in real life. So here's our app that we're going to create, or the first step of our app. And if we look at it in Visual Studio Code, we can see that we have this structure that I told you about, CSS folder with our CSS file, JS folder with our JS file. If we look in our index.html, we can see our references to that JavaScript file and our reference to that CSS file. Then if we go look at our JavaScript, we can see that we load some modules. We're loading this Esri map module and this Esri views map views. You might be thinking, how the heck do I know what I need to load and what this looks like? Well, the help is a great way. So I have this help open. So here is the map view class. And at the very top of all of these classes, it tells me if I want to use this class, it has the require statement listed and the recommended argument. The thing inside of the function, you can call that whatever you want. But if you want your code to be easy to read for yourself and others, I would just go with what's recommended in the help, just so it's easy to know what's going on. Okay, so we loaded the modules. Now we're ready to create our map. We create this new map, and we specify one of the built-in base maps. You could add your own if you have your own custom org base map via URL. You can add that. But out of the box, we have a bunch of different options for you. Dark gray, satellite streets, OpenStreetMap, National Geographic. There's a bunch of strings that define these built-in base maps that you can choose. Here we are choosing gray vector. And then we're creating this thing called a map view. So if you're used to 3x, we didn't have this map view concept. In 4x, we do. So the map view renders that map into the view. So it takes those map data and displays it on the screen. So instead of setting the scale and extent and zoom level on the map, you set it on the view. The nice thing about it is you could easily take one map and draw it in two different views at two different extents, right? But you don't need two maps. You could just have one map. So here we specify this container. This container is an ID to an HTML DOM node, which we specified in index.html. We pass in the map. We specify that we want the map to start at this center point, lat and lon, with this zoom level. And that's really all the code that's required. The CSS is super simple too. It's just saying I want my HTML, the body, and that view div element to take up the full width of the page, 100% of the width and height with no margin or no padding, so no space around the edges of that map div, just a full screen map. And then if I click this go live, it's going to open up this server and run my app, and we'll see that we have that full page app that I showed you earlier. I'm going to show one more thing. In this particular app, we've set the view as a global variable. So this is nice to do just for demo or testing purposes, but I also use this all the time when I want to find out the starting, center, lat, lon, and zoom level or extent for my application. So maybe I don't know the lat and lon of some street in LA where I want my map to be zoomed into when it starts. So I can set the view as a global variable, and then I can come in here in the console and type view.center.latitude, and I can see that's the latitude after I position my map where I want it. And then I can do view.center.longitude, and then there's the longitude, and then I can do view.zoom, and I can see the zoom level that I need to set it as 7. Or I could also specify extent. You can do view.extent. You can come in here and you can see the xmin, xmax, ymin, and ymax. And then you can enter those into your application. So it's just a nice little trick. Okay, and we talked about this briefly when we looked at the source code. We have this map, and we can visualize that map with a map view, which is the 2D view, or a scene view, which is the 3D view. So we have an example up here that looks similar to the app source code where we're rendering it in 2D in the map view. Below it, we are rendering it in 3D using something called a scene view. The code's really similar. You still pass in that HTML DOM node where you want that map to display. You still pass in the map that you want to display there. But then instead of specifying the zoom and center, you specify these camera properties. So scene views have this camera out here, and you could specify the heading and the tilt. and those options, and that's an example there. There's a separate scene view session. We have a link to it at the end. If you're interested in 3D apps, I would check that out. They go into a lot more detail. We just want to talk about some common mistakes that we see. The first one is that little kind of small block above the image. It says, you might see an error in your console that says, reference error require is not defined. This is probably the most common question I see on GeoNet. Basically what happens is that you have probably your module order is off. So let me just go to Visual Studio and show you that. What it usually means is that you have required these modules. So here we've required Esri map and Esri map view. And then we have these corresponding arguments, which is how we work with them in the code. The order here needs to match the order here. So if map is first, this map will be first. This can be called whatever you want. I could call this map view if I really wanted to make it confusing. But when I try and work with it in the code, I'm working with a map. And if it thinks it's a map view, it's going to be looking for properties that are on the map, not the map view, if that makes sense. So just remember that it just has to be, this has to be in the same order. Or you can work with TypeScript and you don't write it this way and you don't have to worry about it. Okay. The other common gotcha is you might open your app and you might see scrambled tiles, like it looks like pieces of the map are missing. Has anybody run into this one before? Usually what this means is that you're missing the CSS file, so you haven't loaded the Esri CSS file. You might also see this if you load your app and you have widgets added to it and they don't look like they're styled correctly. That generally also means you have a missing CSS file, or maybe you're working with the simpler CSS view.css file, but you need the main.css to get the styles from that. So some common mistakes we see. So now I'm going to turn it back to Heather, and she's going to show you how to add layers to our map.
Okay, so we have our base map, right? But that's not really going to be probably pretty helpful. You're going to have your own organization is probably going to have operational layers that you're going to be wanting to work with as well and add those on top of your base map. So we have various layer types that you can access within the API. If you go to the API reference, there's a section here on all the various layers. You can see all the ones that we have. We're going to be working specifically in this case with the feature layer. So if we go back in, the main thing that I want you guys to take away from all this, and it doesn't matter what type of layer it is that you're working with, the steps are always going to remain the same. So you're going to first need to load that module. So like what Kelly was just showing you, require Esri layers and then whatever the layer name is. You're going to then go in, you're going to create that layer. So in this particular case, we're going in there, we are instantiating a new feature layer. So creating that new feature layer and then setting the properties of that feature layer within that constructor. And then lastly, we're adding that layer onto our map. So we have the add method off of the map and then passing in the layer that we want to add. So again, regardless of what it is that you're trying to add, the type of layer that you're trying to add, the concepts and the steps will remain the same. The properties will probably be a little bit different, but the steps are going to remain the same. So we talked a little bit about the properties. One of the things that, especially if you worked with 3 as opposed to 4, we've tried to make working with it much simpler. You don't have all these different get and set statements that you used to have to work with. Now, basically, you can go in there, create, like in this case, we create the map, and you can just set whatever property it is directly off of, or directly onto that. Like in this case, we have the base map property. We can set it directly on that map. We can also go in there and set those directly within the constructor. So like in the second case here, and you're going to see that within all of the demos that we show. You create the instance, you instantiate the instance of your of the class that it is that you're working with, and then you can pass those properties in. And again, we're talking about layers in this case, but this goes across the board. So you have these properties, you can go in there, and when you instantiate it within your constructor, you can pass those in, whatever properties that you have within that class. All right, we can also watch for property changes. So like back in 3, it really was dependent upon whether or not our developers exposed these, exposed the events for whether or not you can listen for specific changes within these classes. It's not the case within 4. If there's a property for it, you can actually watch for that property and see when things change. And then when that happens, go ahead and do whatever it is that you need to do. We have this all written up here. It's a guide topic. Oh, wrong one. Sorry, we're going to go into, this is one of the guide topics, or the API reference. We're going to go to the guide topic, and it's going to be under working with the API and properties. Okay, and we talk a little bit about that all within here. Alrighty. We also have these utility methods. So this watch utils, really useful. It just gives you easy functionality when working with this watch functionality. So different types of methods. You can watch for when a property changes only one time. There's a bunch. You can watch for when a property becomes false, when a property becomes true. Just different things in here. So it's just basically just an easy utility to work with when trying to watch for these changes. And we have a sample here as well. And like Kelly mentioned, all of these slides are available within the repos. So if you're not like, oh, she's clicking on a bunch of stuff, I wasn't able to get the URLs for everything, they're all linked within there. So if you go to that later on down the line, you should be able to get into all of this. So we have a sample here called Watch for Changes. It's not the most beautiful, but you can actually go in here and, one thing I forgot to mention when I talked about the samples with you guys was that you can actually go in and explore you can explore this, so you can work with it within our sandbox. Okay, so we have a sandbox here, very similar if you've worked with 3X, it's the same concept. You can see how everything is written. You can actually go in here and mess around with things if you want to. We also have, you can share this out. So let's say, for example, you're messing with some things, you may have found something, or maybe you found a bug. This is a really good, a useful utility to work with. You can go in here, create this in a code pen, save it out, and then give that link to whoever it may be. Sometimes it's the support people that you call. So, sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. So here we just give you a bunch of different scenarios and different listening for different types of, watching for different types of changes. All right, so let's actually see the sample. All right, so we have our base map. We're just gonna go in and we have some data here that is basically, we have some Polygon endpoint data that just goes in and it represents private school versus public school enrollment within the United States. So in this case, we just have our Polygon data. So I'm gonna go ahead and just open up the underlying source. And this is where Kelly was saying everything is in that main JS file. And I have an extension on Chrome here to make things a little bit easier on the eyes. You'll see here, I'm requiring the Esri layers feature layer, passing in that feature layer. And I actually have I have a point and a polygon. I'm only rendering the polygon in this case. So if we take a look here, you'll see I'm creating that instance of that feature layer, and I'm passing in the URL to this particular feature service layer. And if you take a look here, you'll see this is within the services directory, this is that URL. We have some drawing info, and the renderer is specified and saved within that within this layer. So we just have like this solid blue color, gives an outline and so forth. So if we took a look back here, you'll see here, it's going to take whatever is saved within that layer. If you don't change the rendering, it's going to take whatever in that layer and just pass that rendering within that feature layer as well. So we pass in, we create the feature layer, we set the property, in this case we only have one property, that URL, and then we listen for when the view is ready, and when the view is ready, We're going to pass in, we're going to add that private schools poly feature layer that I just created up here. We're going to add that into the map. Okay, so those 4 steps. Required it at the top. We instantiated it here with the new constructor. We passed the properties in within the constructor, and then we added it to the map. Okay, and if, like I said beforehand, if we take a look, feature layer, there is a very slow network connection right now. If you take a look at the properties within this feature layer here, all of these, unless it's marked as read-only, you should be able to set. Okay, and there's quite a few. All right. Okay, I'm going to let Kelly talk about rendering.
Thanks, Heather. Okay, so rendering lets you define how the layer is going to look or be symbolized in the view, right? So you can have a layer that contains content that you want to render with several unique values. Like maybe you have this US states layer and you want to categorize it and display it by region. So you want to display one symbol for the Northwest US, another for the Northeast, another for the Midwest. So you would set up this render and you would define a symbol for each of those unique value categories, and then it would render based on some field information or some information in your application. So the basic coding pattern is listed here in the box. So we just create, in this case, a unique value render. We'll define a whole bunch more code that sets the render's properties, so we have to create a symbol for each of those. But basically, you create the render, and then you create the feature layer, how Heather just showed you in the last example, and you specify the renderer when you're creating that feature layer. So you specify the renderer property, point it to that render that you just created, and that layer will draw with the new symbology that you defined. So symbols, renders, again, are made up of one or more symbols that you can assign to particular features, points, lines, or polygons. So here's an example where we create a symbol. It's a simple marker symbol. That marker symbol will also have properties. Each different kind of symbol has different types of properties, but a marker symbol might have color, size, URL maybe to an image if it's a picture marker symbol. And then after you create one or more symbols, you assign that symbol to the renderer. Here we set a default symbol for the unique value renderer that it will use if it needs, if it doesn't have a unique value for a particular type. One of the nice things about the API in general, and it's used a lot when you're working with renders, is that we have this thing called autocasting. So we talked about requiring the module and figuring out which module you need to load. You don't need to load every module. If the API reference has the autocast label, then that means that the API is smart enough to know when you're using it, and it'll load it for you. So you don't have to add another module to your require statement. We have a sample. This is create layer from portal item, and it shows autocasting. So let's look at that really quickly. So this one actually autocasts this portal item. We have this layer class, and it has a from portal item method. And there's actually a portal item module in the API. You could load it, you could require it, and you could say my var my portal item equals new portal item and set this ID. Or you can do what we call autocast, which is you just pass in this portal item and specify the ID, and the API does its magic behind the scenes and knows you need that portal item module and gets it for you. So keep an eye out for that autocast label. There's also a whole topic in the guide. We have a link in this slide. You can click on that link. It'll take you to the guide topic that talks about it in great detail. It even has a sample showing the traditional way, which would be to require, in this case, color, simple line symbol, marker symbol, and renderer, because we're working. And then so it shows that we create new color, new symbol, line symbol, new simple marker symbol, new color. So that's the traditional way. If you use autocasting, we're just requiring the feature layer. And then when we create this symbol, we just specify the properties. And then we specify the renderer and pass in that symbol. So it's a lot less code. I hate typing if I don't have to, and if I can write less code, I'm all for it. So check out this autocasting help topic. Compare the two samples, and you'll see the differences and how it can be a little bit easier to use. Okay, so let's look at a demo app where we update the feature renderer. So this is the same app. Heather added the layers. Now we're going to update the symbology so it looks like this picture here. So let's look at the source code. Okay, so here we have our app. The first thing that we're doing is creating this default symbol. We're using Autocasting, so we're not instantiating a new simple fill symbol. We're just specifying the properties for a simple fill symbol. This type lets the API know that it needs to get that simple fill symbol. Then we're going to create a render. In this case, we're rendering based off information in a field called private ENR, probably private enrollment. We're looking at some value in that field to set up some various color stops. So we're saying if the value is 0.044, this is the color and this is the label. And we do that for all of the values that we want to draw in a different color. We have another render, and this is for the other feature class we have in the app, which is a point layer. So we have this one. We're using a picture marker symbol. We're also auto-casting it. We're specifying the URL to an image that we want to show for each of those points and defining the width and height. And then we have our feature layer code that you looked at before. The only difference now is that we set the renderer, the point one to the point renderer we created, and the polygon one to the polygon one we created. We also define opacity on the polygon layer so it's a little bit transparent. And on the point feature layer, we don't want all the points to render at all scales. We only want them to show when you're zoomed in. So we set a min scale and a max scale on that layer. So let's go back. So if we zoom in, eventually there's our point symbols they render. And this is with the image that we specified in our source code. So they're drawing with this little image at the width and height that we specified. Now Heather's going to talk about pop-ups.
Cool. Okay, so we have our map. We've had some layers. We've symbolized or rendered them, but it's probably not going to tell your end user all that much, right, about the specific features that you're looking at. You might want to have some interaction set within your map, and you can do that using pop-ups. So by clicking on individual features, you can go ahead and display specific information based upon whatever you have specified within this pop-up or for this pop-up. So pop-ups generally, like it says, it's going to provide information, whether it's on feature attributes. It can give you information on the location that you clicked on. You can actually specify a pop-up as well. So if you're working with something like a search widget, you can set up a pop-up to show however you want to have those search results to display. You can have that specified within your pop-up. And then, like it says here, it's fully customizable. So the view, map view, whether it's a map view or a scene view, each view has an associated pop-up. So the pop-up is a property off of the view. You can set your content directly within this. Another way of doing that, though, is the feature layer has a pop-up template property itself. You can create the pop-up template and then set that pop-up template within that feature layer, and that's what we're going to show you within our demos. You can also position where you want or how you want that pop-up to show or to display. So if you click on a feature, by default it's just going to basically show, based upon where that feature is located. It's generally just going to float usually like right above it. But you can dock those. You can have that maybe docked to the upper right, left, or whatever it may be. So if we take a look in this case in the pop-up template property, you just take a look at the scroll and you can see there's a lot of stuff in here. What we're going to take a look at, though, is the content. Okay, so our content property of the pop-up template, you can pass in a string, you can pass in an array of objects, you can function, a promise, whatever it is. In this case, we are working specifically with we're setting in these pop-up elements. So we're going to pass in an array of objects. These objects are going to be these pop-up templates. There's 4 different types. You can just do straight text. You can work with media, which would be like if you want to show a chart, if you want to show some images. Or maybe you just want to show some field information that you have within your features. So you can specify the fields, what type of information you want to show within those fields. We also have attachments. So if you have attachment information that you have, maybe you have some relationships set up within this feature service. Some attachments within this relationship. It doesn't have to have a relationship, but I'm just giving an example here. I see that quite often. You can bring all of that information on over as well by setting the attachments pop-up element within this content property of the pop-up template. That's a mouthful. So actually, let's just take a look at it. I think it'll be easier to see. Make sure I'm not missing anything, and I'm not. Okay. All right. All right, so we have the map, the rendering, and so forth, like we just saw. So I'm going to go ahead and we'll take a look at Pennsylvania. If I click on Pennsylvania, what we should see here is I get my pop-up, and the way I have it configured is it's showing me a bunch of field information. Okay, so I've got a lot of stuff. There's majority grade levels, so the majority of the private schools are elementary type private schools. The ratio of private schools to the total number of schools, just a bunch of stats. And then down here, I have some media info, and this is too big. There we go. And down here, I have some media info. So I have a pie chart that I've set up to show the ratio of private and public school enrollment. And I also I threw in a bar chart as well, just to show you the total number of private schools in comparison to public schools. Different colors, but if we take a look at the actual code, you can see here I have required, so I'm working with the pop-up template, and if we go down here, you'll notice here I'm creating a new instance of the pop-up template, and within the pop-up template, this is what I want you to look at. So we have this content property. The content property is what I have here is that, so I have an array, and in this array, I'm passing in my field, so I have an array of specific objects. So I have some field info, so I'm passing the pop-up element, which is the fields, which takes in an array of field information. So I've got some fields like state name, I've got a field of private majority, private schools, things like that. And then, so there's quite a few in there. And then I have my second array of media info. And this is where I specify the type that it is that I'm working with. So if you're working like a bar chart, a pie chart, if you're working with an image, this is where you would pass all of this in. And all of the different types, everything is specified within or documented within that page that I just previously pointed you guys to. So I know this is a lot of information. I'm kind of throwing a bunch of stuff at you, but for the sake of time, this is why we have that GitHub repo with everything in there. So after the fact, you're kind of drinking through the fire hose a little bit on this one. You're going to get a lot of information, but hopefully afterwards, if you choose to, you can go back in, download a lot with some of this stuff, and play around with it a little bit. So basically what I've done here in this huge chunk of code is I've created this pop-up template, all right? And then within this private schools poly, this feature layer, I have this pop-up template property that I'm setting equal to that pop-up template that I just created up here. Okay, so I'm passing that into that constructor passing that into that pop-up template property within the constructor. Okay. Am I missing anything? I don't think so.
Okay, so now we'll talk about querying features. Often when you have this layer added to the map, you might want to query features. We have an example, or an addition to our sample that we'll show you where we query that state features layer, get every state name, and add it to a list in alphabetized format. And we're using layer view query features to do that. So the query is actually happening on the client side. But we use this query features method. We pass in a query. A query is just an object that has all the query parameters we want to search, like a where clause might be applied or what fields we want to search. There's a whole bunch of different query options you can look at in the help. And then we get back the result feature. So we have this for each loop. We loop through each of the features, and we get the attribute ID. Once we get those IDs, we just create a drop-down list, a select box in HTML, and add each item to the list. And then finally, we use the layer view highlight method to highlight that feature when we zoom to it. So let's just look at this really quickly. So we'll look at the source, and the relevant information is way down here. So here we create our query. We create the query using this create query method. It's probably a little hard to see there. It's right here. So we call create query in the layer view. This gives us a default query with a bunch of default options set up that we can change if we want, or in this case, I'm just going to leave them the same. Then I specify one parameter. This is order by fields. I want to say I want the content to come back alphabetized by state name so I can present it in my list in that format. And then I just call query features and do the for loop like we talked about on the slide. So let's see the sample in action. So here is our drop-down list. We can select a state. Let's choose Arizona, zoom to it, and then we highlight it using that layer view highlight method that's new at 4.8 for 2D maps. And next I'll show you my favorite thing. I think I mentioned earlier that I don't really like writing a ton of code if I don't have to. I mean, it's not that I don't like writing code, I do. I don't like typing a lot. So if I don't have to type, and if someone can write that pop-up template code, I don't know. I don't want to write every field that I want in the pop-up. I don't want to define the chart through code. I really don't want to create a unique value render and specify all my colors through code. I'd much rather just use ArcGIS Online. How many people here already use ArcGIS Online or Portal? So if you're already using it, you can go into ArcGIS Online. Somewhere in here I have, you can go into ArcGIS Online, you can use the tools there to symbolize the data without writing code, to define a pop-up. So here we've used the user interface tools in ArcGIS Online to create our map, to add our layers, to specify the extent we want it to start at, and to define the pop-up. Then I can save this and just take this ID that's in the URL, and the JavaScript API knows how to take that ID and build a map based on it with all of the information you defined in ArcGIS Online. So we'll go and look at that sample. So we have this demo. Here's our map. We've got the same map going on. We have our pop-up, we can dock it. It has that same chart in it. So all that stuff is done for us. And let's look at the source code. Before, our file was getting a little long, maybe 100 plus lines of code, and now we have all that same capability, and this is our code. So here's that web map ID. So we create a web map, pass in that ID, and we create our map view. So this lets you spend more time on interesting code, like organization-specific code, writing custom widgets, writing custom logic for your app, and less time on what I perceive as less interesting code, writing a render and figuring out all the colors and getting the hex values or RGB values for all of them. That's not my favorite. So I think the web map's really nice feature.
Yeah, and you're going to see more and more, a lot of our samples now, we're kind of heading that direction. If we have a web map, we'll just go ahead and bring that in and then use the layers, or work with what we can directly off the web map. Just keeps things simpler. So lastly, I know we're getting a little close on time. This used to be a session that we had an hour and 15 minutes, and we couldn't decide on if we wanted to cut anything, so we just said we're going to give you everything, and hopefully we can get the stuff in. So lastly, we have widgets, and widgets basically is when you want to encapsulate specific functionality. So we have widgets for all different types of things. You can create, there's widgets for search functionality, there's widgets for directions, coordinate conversion, that's a relatively new one. Zoom widgets, print widgets, pop-up, all different types. So when we work with widgets, again, this kind of goes back to like when we were working with layers. It doesn't matter the type of widget that you're working with. The concepts of working with the actual widget within the code are always going to remain the same. You're going to need to require it. You're going to need to instantiate it. You're going to pass any of the properties in it. And in this particular case, what we have here, I'm going to hopefully not mess it up if I make it too, no, yeah, I might make it too big if I don't mess it up. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. So in this particular case, we actually have 3 widgets that we are working with, or we're showing. We've got an expand widget, which basically all that does is it allows you to take other widgets and work and kind of use it as a container, so you can open and close it. Just kind of collapse it and make it smaller, make the widget open, shut it down and make it smaller, just to kind of tidy up and clean up your map, so it kind of saves you a little bit of real estate. We've got a legend widget that we have here. You're always going to want to pass in the view. So each of the widgets is going to have a view property, and you're going to want to pass in the view that you want to have that widget associated with. Okay, so we have our view property. The legend, we're showing you in this case the legend widget because we think that it's kind of cool. We have this new property off of it called style. So initially it was just like a standard legend, what you guys are probably familiar with, just a little box, maybe have some squares in there with, if it's a polygon, showing you some shades and labels and so forth. This is a little bit different. I'll show you exactly what it looks like in just a moment. And then in this particular example, we're also going to group. So we have our legend, and we're going to group it in with some bookmarks. So that's a newer widget as well. We also have the view UI. So the view has a UI property on it. And then within that, you can actually add these widgets. So that's what we're going to be doing. So we create the widget, we set the properties for the widget, and then we add the widget into the view. Okay, you can also move them. Okay, so if you have an existing in your application, you have an existing widget, maybe you dynamically need to move something, you can do that using the UI off of the view. You can also remove them too. So in this case, we're going in and we're adding an array. So we're adding the legend and the bookmarks, and we're telling it we're going into the top right section of the UI. So let's take an actual look at this. We have our web map, that web map that Kelly just showed you. Within that web map, I created bookmarks. So if you go in, I just opened up ArcGIS Online, had that web map open. You can set up specific bookmarks, saved out that web map. Those bookmarks are saved within the web map as well. So in this case, what I've done is I have 2 widgets. I have a legend widget, which just showed you by default open. I also have this bookmarks widget. These widgets are encapsulated within the expand widget, and that's why what you see, this little collapse, this open and shut, that's what that expand widget does. All right. I also have them grouped so that if I have one open and I click on the other one, it's automatically going to shut off or turn off or collapse that last one and open up this new one. So it's not too busy. You don't have too many things going on. All right. So if we click on, I don't know, we'll go to Milwaukee. You can see here in my bookmark widget, Los Angeles, very similar. Again, in this particular code, I'm just pulling bookmarks directly saved within the web map, just for simplicity's sake, but you can also go in if you like to make things, if you want to make it harder, or if your application requires it, you can manually go in and create the bookmarks in the API as well. So take a quick look. All right, so what we're doing here is we are grabbing the first, so we're getting our polygon layer, our feature layer, and we are creating this expand widget, okay? And in this expand widget, we have a content property, and I'm passing in the content of this legend, okay? And this is that style that I was talking about. So, oh, that's ugly. Make that smaller. There you go. So this is that card style that I was referring to. It's a little bit bigger now because I'm zoomed out. If we get out of there, you'll see here, there it goes, gets rid of the points. All right, so we're just seeing the polygon. If you don't like that, you can just revert back to the original style as well. You can do that as well. We're passing in the view, and we're giving it the group. So the group where we want this to be located. All right. We also have another expand widget for the bookmarks. Okay, same exact thing. We're giving it the view for where the bookmarks should be associated with, and then the view for the actual expand widget. And then the big thing here is I want these 2 widgets to be grouped together. So if one is toggled on, the other one should be toggled off. we need to make sure that this is the same name. Okay, so both are the same name. I'm saying if the legend is true, I'm going to go ahead. So it was open by default when I opened up the map or the application. So that's where this comes into play. And then the very last step was on the view UI, I added that legend and I added the bookmarks and I told it where to, I specified the docking position of where I wanted that to go. All right. So we threw a lot of information at you guys. I know that it's 1 hour. It's an intro session, so it's kind of like the sun and the moon and the stars combined. And you know, where are you going to start? Hopefully, we gave you a little bit to go off of. We have our repos: Kelly Hutchins. I also have one, H. Gonzago. We'll have some useful information there. For you TypeScript people, Kelly does she's taken a lot of our samples and converted them to TypeScript. So if you take a look at some of her repos, there are some in there. Our user forums, really, really useful. Definitely don't pass those by. For those of you working within Slack, we've got a good spatial community, good questions, answers. Some of myself, I'm in there. I know we've got some of our developers that are in there as well. So yeah, definitely take advantage of that. This is basically probably already been done, so let's go. Is there any Wednesdays in there? Yeah. So we've got some others ahead, like the road ahead. That's where Jeremy sits down and has a little powwow with everybody and kind of talks about what they envision for future, for future releases and so forth. Best practices, I think Kelly's doing that one. Developing, if you're interested in getting into developing your own widgets, 2D visualizations. So what Kelly showed you with rendering, that really floats your boat. You want more information on that. Christian's doing that. He's awesome with the rendering stuff. So definitely go in, take a listen. Mobile apps, 3D visualization. There's just a lot of really good stuff out there right now. I know that we have a minute. It's at the end of the day. So we are here. Kelly and I are here. We are here, and I'm also in the showcase for the rest of the week. Kelly's in the showcase as well. Please take the survey. It's the only way that we know how we can make things better. I'll put that repo link back up there for those of you who may have missed it or walked in late. And we'll be up here if you guys want to ask any questions. I do know if anybody's coming in afterwards.
I don't think so. I think so.
Yeah,
last session. But if somebody comes in, then we'll.
Yeah. So there you go.